So this morning begins a brand new series, and I'm going to leave this for the present. I'm going to leave this in our gallery view so I can see you and you can see me, because it's a whole lot more fun in my book. But we're looking at a topic for the whole month, which is about spiritual psychology. Hang on for just a second. Okay, so I think I mentioned to you all last week that the September issue of the Science of Mind magazine is dedicated to some really powerful topics, including fear and looking that right in the face, and also the mind-body connection. It's a tremendous issue with a lot of valuable information in it. And I decided that what I wanted to do for this month was to focus on spiritual psychology, because it is one of the ways that Ernest Holmes, our founder, describes this teaching. And it appeals to me. I'm not a person, some of you are. I am not one of those people who took very many psychology classes or got a degree in anything related to that. And yet I've had a lifelong interest in understanding what makes people tick. I guess I thought as a little kid that if I could understand it in life, it might get better. And really, that has been the impetus for everything that I've sought to learn, is the more I understand it, the better I feel. So my understanding of psychology comes from my own experience and my own desire to know, and an instinctive idea that in understanding I might feel better. And it's worked pretty well so far. The other half of that, of course, is the spiritual element. So before we begin, I want to share a couple of things, and then I'm going to give some definitions to sort of lead us into this conversation. And I'm going to share a little bit, and then we're going to have our own conversation. So for starters, again, the September theme is spiritual psychology and you. And today's discussion, as it says on the screen, is the spiritual psychology of work-life balance. So we're going to start with a couple of definitions of those things, and then we're going to look at where psychology takes us and where our type of spirituality picks up and takes us a little further, and where we just might end up if we apply some of these things. And before I do that, I want to insert a little bit of humor. As you know, if you're searching for a car or a refrigerator or a certain kind of something, do you notice how it shows up everywhere you look? Well, I've heard that this is true, and I've mentioned it before. When I make a commitment to talk about something, it seems that, of course, well, I start thinking about it on purpose. And as a result of thinking about it, there are more examples of it that show up in my experience. So I've had some really laughable circumstances, even this morning, regarding work-life balance. For example, my hair is a little bit wet, because I had the appearance of a couple of things not going well and seemingly running out of time. And I handled them and thought, I just laughed to myself and thought, well, there you go. You know, I am living it right now. The other thing is, this whole thing was based on Labor Day. So, hey, let's talk about work. But the other part is that in the course of all of this, not only did I have experiences that reminded me about what this work-life balance stuff is, but the other part was my commitment, as I mentioned last week. Edwin Gaines says, if you want to learn something, if you want to learn about something, teach it. And if any of you know me, if you've ever called me on the fly, you know that I live by Google Calendar. I make agreements, I make plans, I set my sights on things, I make plans, I make agreements, and they involve specific time frames, and they all work great until one of them doesn't. And then it's like the big domino cascade. And I've had a week of opportunities, and I'm sure you know what this is like, to be willing to accept one change, and then having to approach someone else with whom I made another agreement and say, guess what? it changed. So I need to make a new agreement with you. And that changed. So I need to make another agreement. And then that one changed. So I need to make another. It was like all week. And the big shining opportunity was the willingness to be flexible and to trust. So I've already had my fun. But we're going to talk a little bit about what this means for all of us so that we can then have a conversation about it. So for starters, I'm defining spiritual initially as this: relating to or affecting the human spirit or soul. And we'll say, just because I'm borrowing this from online dictionaries, that psychology could be most simply described as the scientific study of the human mind and its functions. And go a little further with the root of psyche. We recognize that psychology is looking at mind, mental, spirit, unconscious, the soul, spirit, again, life, or one's life. So it's all about life in the context of our own psyche, our own perception, our unconscious, all that juicy stuff that we know something about. Those of you who are schooled in this area know far better than I do that psychotherapists, for example, and also people who just commit to looking with another group of friends or allies or buddies or supporters in an area of mutual desire to grow, what we do is we look at what are the root causes of things. I know I spent a couple of years in therapy absolutely every week. It was an absolute necessity at big turning points in my life. Big changes, big disappointments, big things that I needed help navigating. And what I was led to do was discover the root cause of things, to discover what was really going on behind my reactions, my feelings, my behaviors, what was really going on, because the origin and the nature of those problems gave me a place to start to heal, to deconstruct them, and to build something different. And they were things like, major change in work, geography, marital status. One of the times that I went into therapy for a year is because I had gotten engaged to be married and bought a business and moved, and it all went down the drain in a big way. It was a big, messy, painful life lesson that was too much to bite off, that it wasn't going to work that way. And I got to find out. And I had someone who would sit with me once a week and work through the naturalness of those life experiences and help me to discover the origins of them. When I talk about that, I'm talking about a life experience revealing to us what our belief systems are. So here's where science of mind or new thought takes it a step further. So if you have either with a therapist, a mutual support group, a trusted friend, or your journal somehow discovered that you have a handful of things that you learn to think and believe in and expect from life that maybe are not the best, and yet they're what you normally do, your default. If you had those things and you could take them further by turning a key in a lock and opening a door, that might be what we do at Centers for Spiritual Living and New Thought Centers and with practitioners and ministers and spiritual coaches. And what that is to discover the relationship between your belief system, the creative process, and the things that you end up experiencing. So for me, that was what the progression was. That all this time, I go from being a pretty young kid, in my early 20s, navigating through all this stuff in life, learning some life skills and tools through therapy, self-help, workshops and books galore, of course, and mutual support programs. And I started to develop an understanding of how life works, my relationship to it, and how to move through it. And throughout that whole time, I began to learn about the science of mind and spirit. And the science of mind and spirit is simply a spiritual psychology. It says not only is all that stuff true that you've heard or learned about psychology, but here's this other element, your personal connection to the universe, your place in all of it. Try this on for cosmology. That place where you are is that you're one with everything. It has made you in its image and likeness. And when you think something, you have a feeling that follows, and the feeling turns into emotion. Emotion triggers the creative process, and all of that leads to a manifestation in your body and your affairs of something happening. Something happening. That's a lot of words to say there's a direct correlation between what we believe and what we experience. So you see, when you go to your therapist, when you go to your your self-help well, when you go to your mutual support posse, or whatever it is that you do to say, gee, what's going on here, and take that and say, well, gosh, it looks like early on I learned to believe X. And then turn the key and say, wow, so I learned to believe X, and now I know that the law of cause and effect responds to whatever I believe and shows up as my experience. Now, this is not instantaneous, but this is what happens over time. Then, gee, maybe if I want to have a different experience, I'm going to have to clean up that old false belief that's holding me back. That's really all it is. So the one key difference that unlocks the door is that we teach people the correlation between our belief systems, the creative process, and our experience. Sounds good, right? Well, I'm going to give you a couple more from Ernest Holmes about metaphysical stuff. So Ernest Holmes is the founder of the science of mind. He was just a very curious guy who left school in the 8th grade. He grew up on a dairy farm in Maine, and he ended up moving to Boston and then to California, and was just so curious that I think one of his nicknames was the eternal question mark. Okay, he asked a lot of questions. He read a lot of books. He too wanted to understand and find stuff out. And all he did was put together what he found out. So here we are. The science of spiritual psychology, the study of life from the metaphysical viewpoint, is what he calls the science of mind. Again, he calls it the science of spiritual psychology, the study of life from the metaphysical viewpoint. So what are metaphysics? Well, they are the branch of philosophy that deal with first principles of things. They are the examination of the fundamental nature of reality, including the relationship between mind and matter, and between potentiality and actuality. Still, that's a lot of words. Metaphysics says beyond, behind, above what appears to be going on in the physical world, there is information, there are patterns, there are indicators which are helpful to us and can help us find our way. So here's what he says about modern psychology. Modern psychology affirms that all the thoughts and emotions we have experienced since we came into conscious existence are still present in mind. Now, the word mind is capitalized, and I'll explain that in a minute. Where ceaselessly active, they manifest themselves as subjective tendencies that mold the body in health and sickness, and determine as well our reactions to all life and experience. So he's saying that today's thoughts become tomorrow's memories. They are creative, they're always active, and they mold our bodies, and they mold our reactions to life. So, okay, so that thing, that my first impression when I was 4 at the kitchen table with my family, I was the littlest one, and I had this perception about myself in relationship to everyone else in the whole world that was an innocent 4-year-old perception. If I'm still carrying that, it's probably molding my body and my affairs in the physical world and molding my reactions to life. This is not new information. It's just that it's so useful to realize when we take all of the insight that we've learned from all of those places I talked about and realize that what we have come to believe informs the law of cause and effect, triggers the creative process all the time. It can only show up as our experience. So instead of lying down on the floor and thrashing or whatever, having a reaction that is just fighting against it, if we understand how it works and we work with it, it will work for us. So that's the key in the door. So what do we do with that when we talk about work-life balance? I'm going to just move this over here in my line of sight. So this is what we do when we're either doing one-on-one or a group process, or we're in a class practicing this whole business. It goes something like this. So imagine that you're sitting with either a therapist, a trusted ally of some sort, a peer in some way, or you're sitting with yourself and you've provided yourself with private space and ample time to explore what's really going on with you. Write it down, maybe even if you need to cry and the phone's not going to ring, the door is not going to open, you have complete sacred safety, whichever environment we're talking about, to explore this concept of work-life balance. And you say, well, it doesn't apply to me, I'm retired. Well, what if you call it this? What if it is the contrast and the relationship between want to do and have to do? Aha. We've actually been having this conversation since the beginning of time. I know people whose parents, even in this group, right, ended up, and my grandmother was the same, working for other families at the tender age of 13 or 14 on a farm or in a home to help bring home enough money to pay the bills. So even if you're retired, do you still have this mindset that says, there's what I have to do and there's what I want to do? And maybe the have to do is really big and it takes up most of the space, right? And what I want to do is this little, if there's time, at the end of the day or one day a week or a month or after, as soon as, you see? So this idea that there's have to and want to, that there's a conflict between the two, when we paint it that way, we're all having this conversation. And what I have found, this is not an instant fix. Now, you can demonstrate instantly. And it'll take as long as it takes for you to cultivate a belief that shifts everything in your experience to be different. And what happens for most of us is that it is gradual. It is gradual by degrees that we can recognize and affirm and give thanks for and tend to and multiply until we realize our life has actually changed. So some of us, you may have tried this. We thought, well, I'm going to follow my bliss and quit my job and see what happens. Well, I know some of those people, and they didn't get to stay on somebody else's couch forever. We had to do more than that. This trip of coming to planet Earth and learning how it works and how to play on this plane and be self-actualized and still have a roof over your head and all of that, man, that is a lifelong journey. That's the deal. That's the deal. So if we were to sit down and say, okay, here's my problem. I feel like I have to do this and I want to do that. What do I do with it? Here's what your spiritual therapist or your ally or your higher self might say to you. Okay, tell me, what are your beliefs about obligation, about necessity, about time, about money? What do you believe about that? and some stuff will come up. Well, of course, I have to do this. And if there's time, I get to do that. Carolyn Mace tells us in Why People Don't Heal and How They Can that we bond into our woundedness because it is socially acceptable in our culture to talk about how bad things are. But it's not so good to talk about how good things are. So we can talk about our wounds, our illnesses, we can talk about our troubles. I'm embarrassed when people call me and some really want to know if I have time available for a certain thing. And I'm like, man, I sound like a broken record because I've got that imprint in there that says there's no time. And I don't know about you, but I have experiences in my body that tell me I feel pressure because I have a perception of more that must be done and not enough time to do what I want to. There's an interesting term in the medical field called chronic. And what that means is that a condition has developed over time and become more prominent. It has made itself more at home over time. And in the medical field, they say that when you have a chronic illness, the only way that you can heal it or address it, actually, they say, is a lifestyle change. Isn't that interesting? So here we are. You have probably discovered that there's an idea about have to and want to that has created an imbalance, and that doesn't feel so good. And maybe because you have retired, you've managed to reconcile that a little bit, and it's not too bad, except for maybe a couple times a year when certain things come up, right? And maybe you haven't. The idea is that if you want this, the want to, the desire, the things that you really want to do to have a more prominent place in your experience, you get to value them more. Start by honestly recognizing them. What are my beliefs about my own desires for fulfillment? You know, people who, what is one of the former presidents, George W. Bush, I'm the younger, he's painting portraits now. So anyway, if there's something that you've always wanted to do, think about this. Is there an old belief system that's holding you back, even though you actually could do it, either a little or a lot now? So there's that. The other question to ask is, imagine if you didn't have this conflict going on in your belief system, would there be any trouble at all? Could you actually maybe do what you need to do and do what you'd like to do? Could you actually discover a better balance between the two? Could you maybe stop believing in and participating in that conflict that might do things like give you high blood pressure or whatever? I don't know the answers to these questions yet, and I'm asking myself because I feel pretty silly having some information up here and still having a different experience in my life that's in contrast to it. So this work life or this have to, want to balance is really about examining old beliefs. I'm sure you've heard this story of the baby elephant that was tethered by, I've mentioned this before, a very small rope, maybe even a big string, but not much when it was tiny. It was tethered for the whole time that it was growing up. So when it became the 2,000-pound elephant, it didn't believe that it could pull itself free from that stake. That's what those early life beliefs do. And yet we can have that holy instant, as A Course in Miracles says, that moment when we finally realize and have our quantum shift that that's not true. And we can chuckle and say, it never was, but I thought it was. Oh, well. And in that moment, when we believe something bigger and freer and newer, we get to start having a new experience. So what is that for you? What is that possibly by degrees? I worked like a dog with a bone on this ideal that I wanted to be who I am, do what I love, and prosper. And you know I've talked about that before. It took years of trial and error, and slowly but surely, as I learned to identify what I really wanted and to ask for it more and more and more, it worked out. And I had to face my demons. I had to face my doubts. I had to face my fears and start creating new beliefs that allowed me to live in a freer way. And I'm still on that journey. So that's the deal. That's what we do. We take this awareness. We recognize that our beliefs inform the creative process and show up as our experience. And in order to have a different experience, we just might have to go back on purpose rather than just waiting for them to be triggered and excavate and redefine some of those old beliefs that are holding us back. That's it. That's the key to work-life balance and anything else in life. And that's what we do here, and that's what we do together. So here's what we're going to do right now. We're actually not going to do another song. We're just going to close this portion of our program, and then we're going to have a conversation about what all of this means to us, okay? So let's do that. So first of all, thank you for choosing to be here on this spiritual reality TV that is your life and my life these days on Zoom. I'm so grateful that we have each other and that we have each other and we have something to lean on as something to anchor ourselves in as we move through this very interesting time of so much reevaluation and change.